Oh, you guys are a good audience. I haven't even shushed you, and you're shushing. Welcome, everyone. I'm Scott Black, director of the Tanner Humanities Center, and I'm delighted to introduce David Wengrow, who will deliver the 2026 Tanner Lecture on Human Values. The Tanner Lectures were endowed by Obert C. Tanner 49 years ago and are dedicated to enriching the intellectual and moral life of humankind. We are deeply grateful to the Tanner family and the O.C. Tanner Company for their continued commitment to the Tanner Lectures. Tonight's lecture by Dr. Wengrow, The Elementary Forms of Human Freedom, is especially fitting. Obert Tanner titled his autobiography, One Man's Journey in Search for Freedom. And this evening's talk invites us to reflect not only on the deep history of human freedom, but also the stories we tell about humanity. David Wengrow is Professor of Comparative Archeology at the Institute of Archaeology at University College London. Trained at the University of Oxford, he is the author of numerous books and scholarly articles on topics including the origins of writing, ancient art, Neolithic societies, and the emergence of early states in Egypt and Mesopotamia. He has conducted archaeological fieldwork across Africa and the Middle East, and his work appears not only in academic publications, but also in public forums such as The Guardian and The New York Times. For many readers outside of his field, Dr. Wengrow is best known as the co-author with the late anthropologist David Graeber of the widely acclaimed book, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanities, which has sparked global discussion among scholars and general readers alike about the nature and the possibilities of human societies. At the heart of The Dawn of Everything is a bold claim. The story we commonly tell ourselves about human history is, in important ways, outdated and misleading. According to the familiar narrative, human beings once lived in small egalitarian groups. An agricultural revolution then led to private property, hierarchy, and states, making inequality an inevitable feature of civilization. We trade freedom for culture, the story goes. Wengrow and Graeber argue that this account is not just oversimplified, but wrong. Drawing on a vast and fascinating body of recent archaeological and anthropological research, they argue that early human societies were far more diverse, experimental, and politically self-aware than we have been led to believe. Rather than moving along a single path of evolution from hunting and gathering to farming in states, our ancestors tried out many different forms of social organization. Sometimes hierarchical, sometimes egalitarian, sometimes shifting between the two seasonally and over time. In light of this new evidence, Wengrow and Graeber challenge the philosophical foundations of our conventional narrative, questioning long-standing assumptions shaped by thinkers like Hobbes and Rousseau. They show that the long millennia of what we imagine as prehistory were full of social experiments by conscious political actors who are endowed, like us, with agency, creativity, and the desire to reflect on and change their societies. We are projects of collective self-creation, they write. What if we approached human history that way? What if we treat people from the beginning as imaginative, intelligent, playful creatures who deserve to be understood as such? Armed with this radical notion that other people are just like us, Wengrow and Graeber suggest that inequality is not the inevitable outcome of complexity, scale, or civilization. The archaeological record offers examples of large, sophisticated societies, including some of the world's earliest cities that operated without rigid hierarchies or centralized coercive power. If that is the case, then our most important question may not be about the origins of inequality, but rather about how we came to see our current arrangements as inevitable and what possibilities we may have overlooked. This is what makes Professor Wengrow's work so compelling. It's not only about revising our understanding of the past, but also about expanding our sense of political and social possibility in the present. By challenging deeply rooted assumptions about the past, it invites us to reconsider what futures are open to us. Please join me in welcoming David Wengrow.
Thank you, Scott, for that very generous introduction. And thank you to the Tanner Lectures Board and the Humanities Center for trusting me with the responsibility and the great honor of giving these lectures. I've recently been struck by the reappearance in historical writing of a particular narrative about the origins of political liberty. The point of this narrative is to underscore the exclusive origins of liberty as a political value in the European Middle Ages. It locates those origins in a slightly mysterious fusion between the egalitarian ethos of Germanic warrior bands, the early Christian church, and remnants of bureaucratic structures left over from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. As I say, it is a very old story. It tells us that liberty as a political value has its beginnings in systems of male bonding, or even masculine love, which created voluntaristic forms of political association based on what is known in the German literature as Gefolgschaft, followership. These new forms of association were to be found outside the realm of kinship and family relations. In the narratives I refer to, the domus or household is conceived as the incubator of servility and femininity. They tell us that political liberty in all its modern forms, everything from independent city-states to parliaments, universities, and private business corporations, came into being when Western societies threw off these fetters of patrimonial authority. Now, much of this reconstruction might simply be dismissed as a myth based on absurdly selective readings of Tacitus mixed with Orientalist and homoerotic fantasies of fin de siècle theorists, especially in Central Europe, where such ideas were formulated in explicit opposition to women's suffrage and what was widely perceived as the corruption of Europe's unique social fabric by mass immigration in the early decades of the last century. The more challenging task, I suggest, is to understand why such ideas keep coming back. Partly, I suspect, this has to do with the very nature of the stories they tell. However much one dresses them up in new clothes, genetic clothes, econometric clothes, evolutionary clothes, they remain at root stories of heroism, stories about civilizational rebirth, the triumph of masculine liberties over the suffocating hold of custom and what is perceived as a decadent patrimonial state. Stories of this kind are designed to push buttons. how do they translate into political practice? Since they are old stories, we might turn to an old theorist for answers. In his book, Crowds and Power, Elias Canetti discussed the process that turns a disorganized mass of humans into an obedient herd, either a victorious mob or lambs to the slaughter, or both. To achieve this, he suggests, what you really need is discipline at the center, a group, usually small scale, whose individual members are poised to act and absolutely committed to their task. To an outsider, they appear as unified as a pack of wolves in their activities. Canetti calls such groups crowd crystals, and he speculated about their origins in things such as seasonal hunting parties, male initiation sets, and groups of mourners who congregate around the tomb of a fallen leader. The clarity, isolation, and constancy of the crystal, he wrote, forms an uncanny contrast with the excited flux of the surrounding crowd. Is what Canetti describes here purely a phenomenon of post-industrial mass society, and these days also rendered into digital forms? Or is it the eruption of something primordial into the heart of modern civilization? Despite his frequent allusions to so-called tribal societies in Australia and Amazonia, it seems hard to avoid the conclusion that what Canetti really had in mind here were the youth brigades who formed the vanguard of fascist parties in Vienna, where he lived until 1938. Canetti noted the strange persistence of such social units. Once in place, they never quite seem to go away. Even when its political projects fail, the costumed band of warriors shrinks back into the shadows of society or into spaces of play and make-believe or gaming to await a comeback. But isn't this too just another illusion of eternity? In the early 20th century, scholars spent much time pursuing the institution of the Männerbund, or male association, into periods of ancient history or even prehistory where it has no real place. One of the striking things about that literature was its morbid obsession with exclusively male forms of companionship, love, violence, and even death as a privileged basis for political association, or even, paradoxically, as core symbols of political liberty. Today, the revival of a particular cluster of symbols, such as the wolf pack in the contemporary manosphere, is often taken to indicate something slightly mysterious, and it seems to be an unavoidable human trait to associate mystery with power, when in fact we may simply be dealing with a stunning lack of political creativity on the part of fascists. In terms of human values, perhaps the larger question raised by all of this runs something as follows. Are political movements grounded in concepts of liberty somehow always doomed to end up this way, with warped fantasies of domination? Or to put it another way, could we ever imagine a concept of political freedom that is not heroic, or is even anti-heroic? My own attempts to grapple with this question arise from my collaboration with the late anthropologist David Graeber. In our joint work, we proposed the existence of three elementary forms of human freedom. Elementary, not in the sense of primordial, but because, one, they manifest across the full range of human societies, familiar to anthropologists. 2, they are embedded in social practices. And 3, a change in one will tend to precipitate change in the others. To introduce these elementary forms of freedom, let me first take up a point developed since the 1990s by Orlando Patterson in studies beginning with Freedom in the Making of Western Culture, down to his most recent books, Enslavement, Past and Present, and The Paradox of Freedom, co-authored with David Scott. This may seem a strange place to begin because a central point of Patterson's work has been to show that pursuing a universal history of human freedoms is probably a fool's errand. The reason for this, he explains, is that freedom is a weird Western concept, born from the long experience of chattel slavery, starting in ancient Greece and Rome, and there is little sense in looking for it elsewhere. For most of human history, the opposite of slavery was not freedom, but rather a position of belonging within a larger social unit. To become a slave meant being torn away from one's kin group and cast into a condition of what Patterson calls social death, from which the only viable escape was not freedom, but reattachment to a kinship group, an extended household, a lineage system, or a civic order. What Graeber and I have argued, in effect, is that such reattachment can itself be conceptualized as an elementary form of human freedom. The freedom to move away from one's allotted place or life situation and be admitted to a new web of human relationships. I would argue that the difference in our two positions is not as great as it might first seem. In fact, they may even reinforce each other. Arguably, what Patterson is really talking about when he calls freedom a weird Western concept is not freedom in all its possible manifestations, but rather a legal exegesis on the meaning of the term freedom. Such explicit theorizing, as he notes, has only tended to arise in very specific sets of circumstances, ones where, in practice, human freedoms are being aggressively denied. This is surely an innovative point, which has the virtue of explaining what is otherwise paradoxical. For example, why freedom occupies such a central position in the philosophical canon of societies that took chattel slavery for granted as a natural part of the world order. Looking beyond the ancient Mediterranean and Western Europe, Patterson's arguments may also help to explain why an explicit legal discourse on freedom has tended to crystallize in other parts of the world at precisely those historical junctures when existing freedoms of movement and political expression were threatened by expanding empires. For example, the term merdeka, a clarion call for Indonesian freedom and independence from Dutch rule after World War II, is already attested in Malay legal codes of the 17th century. By the 18th, as discussed by Anthony Reid, it was identified as a core political value of Buginese and Makassarese populations. In the polity of Wajo, a confederation of seafaring societies located in South Sulawesi, it was recorded that according to the chronicles, one of the founding fathers of the Wajo had announced, the people of Wajo are free from birth. The Wajo were also quite clear on what they meant by this. To secure freedom, their chronicles note, and I'm quoting Reid here, 3 things are crucial. Firstly, not to interfere with people's wishes. Secondly, not to forbid the expression of opinions. Thirdly, not to prevent people going to the south, the north, the west, the east, upstream or downstream. In a context of resistance to Dutch imperialism, Merdeka links Wajo identity and political aspirations explicitly to our first two elementary forms. And as I'll go on to explain in a moment, these are the freedom to move away and the freedom to disobey. One can also accept a related point in Patterson's work, when he notes that the concept of freedom in Western culture has certain peculiar features, features which come out of the realities of slavery, that is, out of the violent commodification of human life. Under such conditions, as he points out, freedom often came to be regarded as a kind of individual possession, to be jealously guarded, a form of power or personal sovereignty which the free person exercises to the necessary cost of others. One knows it is freedom only because in the process of using it, you reduce someone else's capacity to act in the world and be free. It is thus possible to write entire histories of the idea of freedom comprising the views of men who in practice depended on slaves or paid servants for their everyday needs. Such histories, of which Anneleen de Daen's Freedom, an Unruly History is just the latest in a long line, are not histories of practice. They are not histories of people acting in ways that might be considered in any sense free. Rather, they are studies of legal and philosophical debates surrounding the meaning of the words freedom and liberty. This is what is sometimes called the great books approach to the history of ideas. One begins with Aristotle and Cicero, moving on to the revival of their works by Machiavelli and Rinuccini, on through La Boétie to Hartmann, Grotius, the French Enlightenment, German idealists, Tocqueville, and so forth. Such studies tell a story of the Western tradition, which allows us to identify the writings of, say, Plato and Hume as part of the same family of ideas, despite the fact that, had their paths ever crossed, the former would almost certainly have considered the latter to be a hardly civilized descendant of Celtic barbarians. What might happen if we shift the focus from what people have said or written about freedom to what they actually do in practice? What is it at the most essential level that free people are actually able to do, which those who are unfree cannot? What does it mean to be free as a form of social practice? What have been the kind of things that human groups acting together perform in order to avoid falling into states of unfreedom? What kind of infrastructures have they built? What kind of moral and social systems? Based on a broad survey of examples coming mostly from outside the Western canon, Graeber and I arrived at three basic forms: to move away, to disobey commands, and to create new forms of social organization or move between different ones. Today, it must be granted such spaces of freedom have been erased from the lives of most people on this planet, such that it is now difficult to even imagine what it would be like to live in a social order based on such principles. As we also pointed out, however, lack of imagination is not itself an argument. Standard narratives of world history, echoing Rousseau's 1755 discourse on the origins of inequality, tell us that the loss of these basic freedoms is a result of structural transformations which took place in the early phases of human history. The loss of freedom begins, supposedly, with the origins of agriculture and the advent of private property. followed by the birth of urban life, literacy, and the rise of predatory states and empires in the great river valleys of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and China, with the rest of the world bound to follow suit or to succumb. My work with Graeber was dedicated to showing why, in the light of modern evidence, this familiar narrative must now be jettisoned, for the simple reason that it is wrong in almost every one of its most important details. One likely implication is that the erosion of social freedoms has been a more recent and uneven process in world history. On a global scale, it can only be understood in the context of the last few centuries of land enclosure, mass enslavement, genocide, and spiraling wars of destruction, accompanied by new regimes of private property, credit, and debt, and systems of territorial sovereignty, incarceration, and surveillance that would have been beyond the wildest dreams of any Bronze Age ruler or Iron Age emperor. Of course, the last few centuries also saw the global rise of capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, and the growth of representative democracy in various parts of the world. We might be tempted to see here another paradox. How can the rise of democracy be coeval with an unprecedented loss of human freedoms? It is only a paradox, though, if we choose to forget the human cost of modern capitalism, the many local and indigenous forms of direct democracy that were eradicated to make way for representative ones in the service of expanding nation states and business corporations, and how the self-identification of freedom as a core political value of the West went together with largely unqualified support by Western powers for regimes that were actively suppressing democratic reform among much larger populations overseas. In ways that we perhaps don't fully comprehend, all this has also meant a loss of freedom in our own democracies, reducing freedom to largely transactional values, the freedom to expand one's purchasing power, defend one's property, or sell one's labor to the highest bidder. For such reasons, I want to stress that the elementary forms of freedom I'll be discussing today are not simply individual freedoms. As a variety of thinkers have noted, freedoms conceived in purely individual terms can quickly morph into forms of domination, as in Isaiah Berlin's formulation, freedom for the wolves has often meant death to the sheep. In the present moment, we might also recall Berlin's observations on the fate of personal liberty during the reign of unfettered economic individualism, where the injured majority enjoy legal rights and freedoms that they will never be able to exercise except vicariously as a cultural, political, or even military spectacle. The elementary forms of human freedom, as I wish to define them, presuppose the existence of a different kind of social infrastructure to that generated by the nation state, and a different sort of morality to that of capitalism, with its familiar atomizing effects. Accordingly, they have very little in common with the discourse of classic liberalism, which presupposes just the opposite set of conditions. Nor, however, do they share the cozy nostalgia of so-called post-liberalism, with its paradoxical fantasies of returning to a traditional social order rooted in supposedly natural values of family, place, and tribal loyalty, yet utterly dependent on the impersonal machinery of the state to bring that order into being. So what are these three elementary forms? The first freedom, to move away from one's given social context, can only become a lived reality if there exist systems of hospitality through which such individuals can move. Typically, this is expressed in terms of the obligation to offer shelter to strangers, including in cases where an explicit discourse on freedom may be lacking. One of the clearest examples of this that Graeber and I came across is the concept and practice of Wunan, developed by indigenous intellectuals in northwestern Australia, specifically in the region known as the Kimberley, which faces the Indian Ocean. We got little further than compiling a list of references to published works on the topic and had intended to learn much more about it, which is something I'm still pursuing, including an imminent field trip. Wunan is, in fact, a concept of enormous complexity. Over a century of research, anthropologists have used the term to refer to two apparently quite different things. Firstly, a system of art comprising paintings on natural rock surfaces distributed across the ancestral landscapes of the Kimberley. Some of these images can be dated back thousands of years, but they're also maintained and sometimes renewed by indigenous experts, adding new layers to their history. Secondly, Wunan can also refer to a system of hospitality zones traversed by Aboriginal people from hundreds of different communities and language groups. In anthropological parlance, this forms a web of clans and moieties which outspan local groups, ensuring everyone has potential hosts in distant places. In the course of asserting their native title, intellectuals of the Ngarenyin nation have made a point of explaining to outsiders that Wunan means even more than this. Above all, it is a code of law, which is impressed on the land through the medium of images and can only be learnt and understood by moving through it. At the same time, they explain it is also a set of prescriptive and proscriptive rules of civilized behavior, the most prized possession of a Ngarenyin adult. I quote here the words of a senior lawman and artist, the late David Maljali, who argued that Aboriginal civilization is built on a combination of aesthetic, topographic, and moral principles, which he contrasted with the economic principles that govern state and corporate relationships with the land. Wunan comprises a rich body of ideas and practices which are sacred to its practitioners, as are the images that mark its presence in the landscape. I mention it here to indicate, in what must be a very superficial way, something of the nature of these complexities, and also just to show how different things can be from our usual expectations of what terms like art, law, and freedom really mean. Let me turn now, in what must again be necessarily brief terms, to our second elementary freedom, the freedom to disobey arbitrary commands. Much as the first freedom presupposes an infrastructure of hospitality and asylum, the second freedom presupposes the cultivation of skills and even a kind of intrinsic pleasure in practices of argumentation, oratory, and debate. One might consider this a civilizing process, but if so, it is one that leads to participatory and deliberative democracy, as opposed to the concentration of violence in institutions of the state, as argued by Norbert Elias for the civilizing process of early modern Europe. Graeber and I explored the historical case of 17th century encounters between European colonizers and the indigenous societies of North America's eastern woodlands, specifically the Algonquian and Iroquoian-speaking peoples of the Great Lakes. Jesuit missionaries such as Gabriel Sagar, whose 1632 work, Le Grand Voyage du Pays des Hurons, influenced Locke and Voltaire, often marveled at the facility of native people for skilled oratory and debate, while at the same time being openly hostile to the freedom and even playfulness of their social arrangements. Jesuits were especially scandalized by women's freedoms, which were unheard of in Europe of the time. Wendat women controlled agricultural resources. They could divorce their husbands at will. Children were bonded to parents through ties of intimacy and affection, rather than discipline and punishment, including children taken in as war captives from neighboring groups. Sagar found such arrangements to be decidedly more natural than those of typical French households. He was especially struck by the absence of quarrels and tumults in the Wendat longhouse. People generally seemed to get along with each other, which also meant there was little need for lawsuits, judges, or police. In a recent edition of 18th century studies, the historian Peter Walmsley offers a fascinating discussion of John Locke's unpublished notes on Sagar. There, among other things, Locke highlights how such consensual relations extend into the public sphere. The kings of Canada, wrote Sagar, are elective, but their sons never fail to succeed their fathers when they are heirs to their virtues, otherwise not. And their kings are rather obeyed by consent and persuasion than by force and compulsion, the public good being the measure of their authority. As a result of such arrangements, he also observed, overall crime rates were far lower among the Wendat than in French colonial towns, despite the lack of prisons or harsh punitive laws. But how could such facilities for reasoned argumentation possibly have come to those with no knowledge of Cicero or Quintilian? Considering the matter, Jesuits nearly always noted the openness with which public affairs were conducted. So writes Father Lejeune in the 1630s. There are almost none of them incapable of conversing or reasoning very well on matters within their knowledge. Their councils, held almost every day in the village on almost all matters, improve their capacity for talking. I would never have believed, he goes on, that without instruction, nature could have supplied a most ready and vigorous eloquence, which I have admired in many Hurons, or more clear-sightedness in public affairs, end quote. At least some Jesuits perceived a logical connection here between inclusive debate, reasoned argument, and the refusal of arbitrary power. All the authority of a chief was in his tongue's end, for he is powerful insofar as he is eloquent. And this fact alone appears to have had major repercussions, as it was exactly this style of debate, rational, empirical, skeptical, and convivial in tone, which before long came to be identified with the European Enlightenment as well. One might even make the case, that some of these social habits traveled west from the Americas, along with physical habits that accompanied them, like smoking tobacco from pipes and socializing with caffeinated beverages. And of course, the revolutionary thinkers of the Enlightenment also saw these things as intrinsically connected to the rejection of arbitrary authority, especially the authority of the clergy. Scholars of indigenous history in North America, from Francis Laflèche to Willard Rawlings, noted how, before European colonization, migration to new country was conceived as the restructuring of a social order, merging the three forms of freedom into a single project of emancipation, to move away, to disobey, and to create new social relations. What we would now call social movements or revolutions often took the form of quite literal movements through a landscape. When forced migration was adopted as a formal policy of the United States government, the freedom to disobey became increasingly central to struggles for indigenous sovereignty. Firstly, in the refusal to follow commands to vacate one's lands, and then as a refusal of governance structures imposed by the colonial state. As discussed by Audra Simpson in her book, Mohawk Interruptus, such struggles go on. A question arises: if these freedoms are still practiced today among groups who pursue them in the dwindling cracks of our present world order, how should we imagine the greater part of human history? For some time now, I suggest the writing of history and social science on a large scale, the creation of so-called grand narratives, has converged around a simple task: to stop us imagining those kind of things at all, or to confine our imaginations to false binaries. Were humans originally peaceful or violent? Egalitarian or hierarchical, cooperative or competitive, kind or selfish? These things make it impossible to perceive, let alone comprehend, the possibilities of human social life outside the canonical history of empires and states. In my second Tanner lecture tomorrow, I will expand on these themes, and I'll also consider some possible reasons for the persistence of such not-so-grand narratives, taking my inspiration from the ethnographic work of David Graeber in the Central Highlands of Madagascar. Thank you very much.